Chapter 1. The pew beside the font. The village of St. Mildred's on the Green, nestled between two softly sloping hills and a scatter of thatched-roof cottages, had an air of timelessness that few places could boast. Here, time did not so much march forward as it gently meandered like the brook that ran through the edge of the churchyard, slow, unhurried, occasionally whispering secrets to those who stopped to listen. It was on the first Sunday of June, morning as golden and still as a preserved memory, that the 11 o'clock service at St. Mildred's Church began with the expected rustle of hymnals and the faint clearing of throats. Miss Marple, now well into her 80s, arrived punctually as ever in her pale summer hat and dove-gray gloves, her well-worn prayer book neatly tucked under her arm. She took her usual place in the fourth pew from the front on the left side, seat for as long as anyone could remember, positioned perfectly to observe both the pulpit and the congregation with discreet attentiveness. She never considered it spying. She simply noticed things. And this morning, she noticed something rather unusual. A stranger had taken a seat in the fifth pew, specifically on the end nearest the aisle. Not just a stranger to Miss Marple, but to the village itself. In St. Mildred's, even the grocer's second cousin once removed was known by reputation. But this woman was an absolute unknown, and she had, quite oddly, taken a seat in the pew, traditionally left empty out of reverence. It was sometimes used by visiting choirs or young schoolchildren during Christingle services, but it remained unspoken custom that the space beside the font was not for general use. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes lingered on the woman as she sat with unnerving stillness. She was middle-aged, perhaps in her early 40s, wearing an elegant navy coat and a pillbox hat trimmed with a small velvet ribbon. There was nothing untidy about her, on the contrary. Her appearance was fastidiously neat, but there was something in her posture that betrayed a strain beneath the surface. Her hands, though gloved, were clenched tightly in her lap, and once or twice she cast an anxious glance behind her, as if expecting or dreading someone's arrival. The Reverend Cyril Tomlinson, a soft-spoken man with an unfortunate resemblance to a damp sponge, noticed the stranger only once his sermon had begun. His voice faltered momentarily at the sight of the unfamiliar figure, but he pressed on with a passage from Corinthians, delivering it with his usual earnest monotony. Miss Marple noticed something else. The stranger was not following along with the hymn book, nor did she bow her head during the prayers. And when the vicar invited the congregation to rise for the final hymn, "Lead, Kindly Light," the woman did not sing. She simply stood, eyes fixed forward, lips unmoving. A woman avoiding attention by pretending to belong. As the service concluded, and the congregation moved out into the sun-drenched churchyard, the usual chatter resumed. Mrs. Weatherby was informing anyone who would listen that the hydrangeas were blooming 2 weeks early. Mr. Edgecombe was grumbling about the new postman being too quick with the bell. And young Elsie Chivers had lost her Sunday gloves again, though not, Miss Marple observed, her locket, which had apparently been returned to her by the same mysterious boy who had recently taken to walking her home. But the woman in the navy coat did not join the trickle of villagers lingering by the yews. She remained inside the church, still in her pew, as if rooted to the spot. Miss Marple approached the font slowly. She was in no hurry and did not wish to startle the woman, who now seemed to be dabbing her eyes with a folded handkerchief. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, her voice soft and kindly, "I hope you don't mind my saying so, but you look rather out of sorts. Might I be of assistance?" The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were pale gray, almost silver and watery. Double quote. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I shouldn't have stayed behind." Her voice trembled, and she folded the handkerchief quickly, tucking it back into her coat. "I thought I'd just compose myself." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said, lowering herself carefully onto the pew across the aisle. "Churches often bring out old sorrows, don't they? Especially to those of us of a certain age. They carry echoes of things best left undisturbed, or perhaps not. You aren't from around here, I take it? No, I'm not, the woman admitted. I was just passing through. I thought I might attend a service for peace of mind. Miss Marple observed her closely. That's admirable. It isn't always easy to seek peace, especially when one is running from something rather more troubling. The woman looked up sharply. I beg your pardon? Oh, do forgive me, my dear. I tend to say rather too much. Miss Marple smiled. My name is Jane Marple, and you are? Elizabeth Arkwell, the woman said after a moment's hesitation. Widowed. I'm sorry to hear it. Recently? 3 years, she said. Then she added, we used to come to villages like this in the spring. My husband enjoyed quiet places. Miss Marple folded her gloved hands. You chose an unusual place to sit, Mrs. Arkwell. That particular pew hasn't been occupied in, decades. Not since poor Mrs. Lemon had her unfortunate episode and collapsed there during the Whit Sunday service. Heart, they said. But the superstitious whispered otherwise. A flicker crossed Mrs. Arkwell's face. Perhaps surprise, perhaps unease. Ah. Well, she said lightly, perhaps I chose the wrong pew. Miss Marple's eyes did not waver. Perhaps you did. That afternoon, the village hummed with idle speculation. By tea time, word had spread that a stranger had attended the morning service, and that she had stayed behind for reasons unknown. Mrs. Weatherby, of course, claimed to have recognized her from somewhere, perhaps the post office in Paddington, or was it the reading room in Bath? Reverend Tomlinson received an anonymous note through the vestry door sometime after evensong. It was written in a narrow, slanted hand and read simply, she sat where it happened. Someone should have stopped her. He turned pale and unsure. What to make of it, placed it in his desk drawer beneath a pile of unused communion cards. And by the next morning, Mrs. Arkwell was gone. She had left the village inn sometime before dawn, according to Mr. Jennings, who delivered milk to the side. Entrance. Her room was neatly tidied. Her bill left in full save for one curious item, a small leather-bound notebook left behind in the drawer of the knit-stand. Miss Marple. Upon being informed of this by the innkeeper's wife, who felt Miss Marple ought to be consulted in any matter even remotely resembling a mystery, merely nodded and asked for a cup of tea. She did not open the notebook just yet. She would do so, of course, but not before letting the pieces fall a little more into place. For you see, Jane Marple had already begun to feel that this woman Elizabeth Arkwell, if that was indeed her name, had not chosen the pew by accident. At all, something had drawn her to that precise place. And something told Miss Marple that whatever it was, it had roots deeper than grief or superstition. Something, she suspected, was about to be unearthed. Chapter 2. The notebook and the knit-stand. It was a well-known fact in St. Mildred's that Miss Marple was never one to pry, unless, of course, something was crying out to be looked into. So when Mrs. Jennings, the innkeeper's tidy, aproned wife, arrived at Danemead Cottage the morning after the stranger's departure with the now infamous notebook clutched in her flour-dusted hands, Miss Marple accepted it with gentle gravity, set aside her embroidery, and placed the item on the side table beside the tea tray. She paid in full, you say? Miss Marple asked as she poured a second cup for her guest. The blue china clinked gently. Every shilling, said Mrs. Jennings, and not a crumb left behind. Sheets folded, towels neatly laid on the rack neater than I'd have done it myself. But it's that notebook, Miss Marple. Gave me the shivers. Did you peek inside? Mrs. Jennings looked mildly scandalized. Well, I might have glanced, just to be sure it wasn't something criminal. Miss Marple offered a mild smile. Of course. She'd only stayed the one night, booked under the name Arkwell. Said she needed a night of quiet. Didn't eat supper, didn't speak to a soul after church. I thought at first perhaps a writer quiet sort. But you saw her, didn't you, Miss Marple? Something odd about her. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. A woman on edge. One doesn't Attend a village service uninvited unless one wants to be noticed. And yet, she took care to sit in the most unnoticed of places. Mrs. Jennings blinked. But surely beside the font? Miss Marple sipped her tea. Quite. When her guest had departed with a tin of shortbread under one arm and reassurances that Miss Marple would see to things if there was anything to be concerned about, the elderly spinster lifted the leather-bound notebook with careful hands and opened it to the first page. No name, no address. Just a single phrase, penned in a flowing, delicate script. June 4th. I have come back. Miss Marple sat very still. There were no further entries in the usual sense, no diary-style notations. No letters, no confessions. Instead, the pages were filled with fragments. Sentences half finished, names unmoored from context. A list of seemingly random words. Eucalyptus, Black Veil, Whit Sunday. And beneath them, written in firmer hand, forgive me, but I must. Know what happened. There were 2 candles, not 3. Miss Marple turned the page and found more of the same phrases that bordered on poetry or riddles. The hymn began, and no one sang. The bells rang too early. The second hand never ticked. She closed the book gently, her fingers resting on the worn leather. Clearly, this was no ordinary journal. It was the record of a woman unraveling something, possibly herself. Yet there was order beneath the disorder. The repetition of certain images, the recurrence of dates and allusions to ritual. A mind in turmoil. Yes, but not without purpose. Miss Marple's memory stirred. With Sunday. The day Mrs. Lemon had died in that very pew. It had been over 20 years ago. A dramatic collapse in the middle of service, during the singing of Crown Him with Many Crowns. Miss Marple remembered it clearly, for she had been seated just one pew behind, the choir boy who'd fainted. In fright, the smell of lily too strong in the air. The bell that rang too early, yes, that had happened. Someone had pulled the bell rope by mistake, or so it was said. But that had always struck Miss Marple as peculiar, and now here was a woman, Elizabeth Arkwell, if indeed that was her true name, who seemed to know about it. Not only that, but something about candles and forgiveness. She rose from her chair, tied her shawl more tightly, and made her way to the bureau where she kept her clippings and old parish newsletters. A habit some had once called sentimental had, over the years, proved more useful than many suspected. It took her some time, but at last she found the small packet she sought. Parish notices from the early 1940s, yellowed at the edges, scented faintly with lavender and thyme. There it was. Whit Sunday, 1943. Service at 11. Guest organist from Tunbridge Wells. The late Mrs. Agnes Lemon remembered in the following week's newsletter as a devout servant of the church and a patron of its altar guild. Miss Marple examined the announcement more closely. Below the fold, she found something she had forgotten. Candles for the altar donated this week in memory of Miss Sylvia Coombs, 1919 to 1939, by her sister Margaret. Sylvia Coombs. The name sent a mild tremor through Miss Marple's hand. Yes, of course there had been a story there. A girl who died young, barely 20. A local scandal, though never spoken of too openly. A fall from a horse, they'd said. But it hadn't been quite as simple. Miss Marple sat down again and opened the notebook once more. 2 candles, not 3. She knew it now. This stranger, this. Elizabeth Arkwell had not come to the village for peace. She had come for memory, for answers, for something or someone left behind 2 decades past. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the vicareg. Reverend Tomlinson, tall and prematurely stooped, was in his study sorting through paper poppies for the summer memorial service. He welcomed her with the vague embarrassment common to clergymen unaccustomed to female company beyond the altar guild. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, fumbling for a place to rest the paper tray. Come in, come in. Terribly warm for June. Isn't it? Indeed." "I shan't keep you long, Reverend, but I wondered, have you had any visitors of an unusual nature since yesterday's service?" He blinked at her. "Visitors? No, not that I recall. Though, oh, well, there was a rather strange note, now that you mention it." He opened a drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She sat where it happened. Someone should have stopped her. Miss Marple took the note with gloved fingers and examined the handwriting. Feminine, narrow, controlled, but slanted slightly to the left. Not the same hand as the notebook. She was sure of that. "May I borrow this?" The vicar hesitated, then nodded. "By all means. If you think there's something to be concerned about?" Miss Marple gave him a small, serene smile. "I think someone is reaching for a truth that's been buried rather too long. And the past, you know, has a way of making itself heard if one listens carefully enough." She returned home as the sun dipped behind the western hedgerows, and the swifts wheeled high above the roofs of St. Mildred's. The village looked the same. Of course, chimneys puffing contentedly, curtains drawn halfway, the soft echo of piano. Practice drifting from the vicarage window. But Miss Marple knew better. Something had stirred. A memory long dormant. And now, it seemed, someone else remembered too. She would have to find out who. Chapter 3. The Garden of Stone Angels. The following morning dawned clear and bright. The kind of early summer day that lent a false sense of ease to even the most burdened mind. Sparrows chattered among the ivy at Danemead Cottage, and the scent of honeysuckle drifted in through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's parlor. But though the sky was blue and the teapot full, Miss Marple remained in quiet contemplation, her eyes resting on the closed notebook. She had slept little. The name Sylvia Coombs had clung to the corners of her mind like chimney soot. The girl's tragic fall. Yes, it had been declared accidental. But hadn't there been talk? Hushed suggestions over bridge tables, cryptic remarks exchanged over the church flower rota, a family dispute, a young man involved, and a sister Margaret who had, Miss Marple recalled, vanished from the village not long after. Now, decades later, a stranger arrives, sits in the very pew where a woman died, and leaves behind a notebook of riddles and regrets. It was not coincidence. Miss Marple had seen enough of the world's strange patterning to know that at 10:30. She set off with her parasol and a woven basket of garden cuttings, lavender, rosemary, and a particularly cheerful clump of pinks, and made her way through the meandering lane toward the old churchyard. There were practical errands to be done, yes, but also questions to ask, and old stones to read. Sd. Mildred's church stood serene in the morning light, its flint walls mottled with age and lichen, its bell tower casting a gentle shadow across the gravestones that tumbled like crooked teeth in the grass. A path of worn flagstones wound between the graves, leading to the southern wall where the older stones clustered. Beneath yew and ash. Miss Marple was not the only one there. A figure was kneeling before one of the low headstones, a woman in a dark blue coat and straw hat, with an unmistakable air of middle-class propriety. Miss Marple recognized her at once. "Good morning, Miss Peacegood," she said cheerfully. The woman turned with a start, then smiled with faint embarrassment. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't hear you. You move like a cat, you do." "Not so much these days," said Miss Marple with a smile. "My knees have begun to vote against me, I'm afraid. Visiting family?" Miss Peacegood dusted her skirt and stood. "My great-uncle, actually, Bertie Peacegood, used to be churchwarden. I always bring a little lavender near his birthday. He loved the smell." Miss Marple's gaze drifted over the stone. Albert Peacegood, 1865 to 1947. He rested not in work or faith. "A good man," she said gently. "Bit of a fusspot," said Miss Peacegood with a chuckle. "But yes, good." They stood for a moment, in comfortable silence before Miss Marple tilted her head. "Miss Peacegood, do you remember a Miss Sylvia Coombs?" The effect was immediate. The other woman stiffened ever so slightly. Why do you ask? Oh, no reason in particular, Miss Marple said lightly. I was sorting through some old parish papers, and the name came up. I remember she died very young. She did, said Miss Peacegood carefully. A riding accident. Tragic, really. I didn't know her well. I was only a girl, but I remember her funeral. The church was full. Her sister, Margaret, fainted in the front pew. So she had a sister? Oh yes, Margaret was the elder. Very clever, always reading. Not very friendly, if you know what I mean. After Sylvia died, she left the village. Married a doctor, I think, somewhere up in Lincolnshire. Miss Marple nodded, storing each detail. Did anyone ever question the accident? Miss Peacegood's eyes narrowed, and she lowered her voice. You know how people are, Miss Marple. They talk. Some said the horse had been spooked on purpose, that it wasn't just bad luck. And why would anyone do such a thing? Miss Peacegood hesitated, then glanced around. There were rumors. Sylvia was engaged to one of the Edison boys, Giles, I think. But she was also seen walking near. The lake with a different sort. A gardener's son, not quite respectable. People thought she might be playing both ends. And Margaret, well, some said she didn't approve. Others said she was jealous. Jealous? Hard to say. But I remember my mother whispering that. Margaret had always lived in Sylvia's shadow. Sylvia was beautiful, you see. The sort of beauty that made women nervous and men clumsy. Miss Marple nodded once, her eyes thoughtful. And the gardener's son? Left town, around the same time Sylvia died. Some said he was paid off. Others said he ran. No one knows for sure. I see, Miss Marple said quietly. And do you know if either of the Coombs sisters had a child? Miss Peacegood blinked. No, I don't believe so. Why? Oh, nothing, said Miss Marple, smiling faintly. Just curiosity. Family lines often twist in interesting ways. With a polite farewell, Miss Marple continued through the graveyard, winding her way toward the northern edge where the stones leaned more severely and the grass grew higher. There, near a cluster of elder trees, she found a small, weathered marker nearly swallowed by ivy. Sylvia Coombs, 191939. She sang to the wind, and the wind remembered. Miss Marple knelt carefully, brushing away the leaves. Fresh petals lay at the base. White ROSEBUDS that someone had visited recently. She looked up. The nearest gate was still swinging gently on its hinge, though the breeze had long since died. She rose slowly, her hand resting on her parasol for balance. White rosebuds. Not a village. Custom. Not a native bloom for June, but cultivated roses, long-stemmed and deliberate. The same white rose that had been embroidered onto the stranger's handkerchief at church. Miss Marple turned and began her walk home with thoughtful steps. The woman who sat in the wrong pew had not done so by accident. She had come to visit Sylvia Dot, and the question now was why. Chapter 4. An unquiet Sunday afternoon. Sunday afternoon brought with it the sort of languid peace that often settles over English villages after morning worship. Teacups clinked on saucers, dogs snored beneath hedges, and the long shadows of garden tools marked the beginning of that curious pause before supper. But in St. Chad's Mead, there was a hum beneath. The quiet. A sense, almost, that something not quite right had passed unnoticed through its cobbled lanes. Miss Marple, of course, had noticed. The white rose on Sylvia Coombs's grave lingered in her mind. It wasn't just the freshness of it or the fact that white roses weren't grown locally. It was the precise way they had been laid. 3, in a diagonal, almost ritualistic. A pattern she had seen once before in her long years, at a graveside in Sussex, following a family scandal that had never been spoken of aloud. As she stirred her tea with a hand-grown firm from decades of knitting, Miss Marple let her thoughts spin like yarn between needles. She had questions. Not the kind you could ask outright, of course. No one ever said anything directly in a village. That was not the English way. but tea tables and vicarage visits. Chance remarks at the greengrocer's, that was where the real stories lived. And so, at a little after 4, she made her way to the vicarage. The Reverend Giles Ludlow, newly appointed to St. Mildred's, had been in the village scarcely a year, but already spoke with the deferential caution of a man who knew full well he'd inherited a parish steeped in old ghosts. He was a mild, bird-like man with a receding chin and a fine baritone voice, which he used to excellent effect from the pulpit, but far less convincingly in conversation. He met Miss Marple in the rose garden behind the vicarage, where his wife, Angela, was already pouring tea beneath the striped parasol. Angela Ludlow was brisk, practical, and gifted in the art of knowing things she had no business knowing. "Miss Marple," she said warmly, "we were just talking about you. You missed the bell practice on Thursday." "Oh dear," said Miss Marple with an apologetic smile. "I've quite forgotten the time lately." "That's not like you," said Angela with a twinkle. "You never forget a Thursday. Is something on your mind?" Miss Marple, seating herself delicately and accepting a plate of lemon shortbread, took a measured sip of tea. "I'm afraid I've been thinking rather a lot about Sylvia Coombs." The name dropped like a pin into the silence. Reverend Ludlow coughed lightly and stirred his tea. Angela set her cup down and gave Miss Marple a careful look. "My goodness," she said softly. "That's not a name one hears often anymore." "No," said Miss Marple. "But I happened to be in the churchyard yesterday and saw her stone. Someone had left fresh flowers, white roses." Angela's eyes flickered. "How curious." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, curious indeed. Especially when one considers that her sister, Margaret, left the village soon after Sylvia's death and was never known to return." Reverend Ludlow cleared his throat. "You know, I looked into the parish records when I first arrived. Her death was troubling. A tragic accident, I understand." "So they said," Miss Marple replied. "But you know how tragedies linger. The truth, like the poor, is often left out of the official version." Angela raised an eyebrow. "You think there was more to it?" Miss Marple didn't answer at once. She traced the edge of her saucer with one finger. "I think," she said slowly, "that someone has returned to St. Chad's Mead after a very long time. Someone who knew Sylvia. Perhaps even someone connected to her death." Reverend Ludlow set down his spoon. "Are you referring to the woman who sat in Mrs. Fullerton's pew last Sunday?" "I am," Miss Marple replied. "She hasn't returned," Angela said. "I kept an eye on the pew this morning, empty. Most peculiar. A visitor, I thought at first, but she didn't act like one." "No," said Miss Marple. "She acted like someone remembering something. And I have a very strong suspicion that she meant to be seen." Angela folded her hands. "Then she be back." "I believe she will," Miss Marple said. "And when she returns, I intend to speak with her." Reverend Ludlow, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly looked up. "There's something else. I didn't mention it before because, well, it seemed small. But last week, after service, I found the vestry door slightly ajar. I could have sworn I'd locked it after morning prayers. Nothing was missing, mind you, but the old wooden filing drawer, the one with the parish death notices, was pulled out." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "How very interesting. The woman might have been looking for records." "I locked them again," he said. "But if someone wanted to see them badly enough." Angela leaned forward, her expression sharp. "You don't suppose she's related to Sylvia?" "It's a possibility," Miss Marple murmured. "I once met a woman in a boarding house in Cheltenham who pieced together her father's identity using only a baptism record and a brooch. People go to great lengths for such knowledge." Angela's voice was quiet. "You think she's a daughter?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "I think she's someone with unfinished business. And in my experience, the most dangerous sort of visitor is one with a private memory and a public purpose." As they spoke, a figure walked briskly, Down the lane outside the vicarage hedge, a woman in a dove-gray coat, her face turned slightly from view. Miss Marple, sharp-eyed even at her age, caught the glint of copper hair beneath a cloche-style hat and the familiar stride. "She's back," Miss Marple said simply, rising. Angela blinked. Was that her? It was. "And I dare say she's heading toward the war memorial. Shall we go after her?" "No," Miss Marple said calmly, already collecting her handbag. "She wants to be seen. So we must allow her to believe she's unseen. But I shall take a walk in about 20 minutes, and perhaps pass through the Lich Gate by chance." She gave them both a small knowing nod, and turned toward the gravel path that led back toward Danemead Cottage. There was no sense rushing in this sort of thing. Memories, like old wounds, had to be approached gently, and secrets, especially village secrets, had to be drawn out like splinters, with tact, patience, and the appropriate amount of pressure. And if Miss Marple had learned anything in her long life, it was that secrets had a way of surfacing, especially when someone returns to the very place where the silence first began. Chapter 5. The Return to the Lich Gate. The air was beginning to cool when Miss Marple left the vicarage garden. A light breeze stirred the yew trees along the churchyard path, rustling their ancient needles like whispers carried down the years. Evening sunlight slipped through the stone arches, stretching across gravestones that bore names long faded, save for those few that stubbornly refused to be forgotten. One of those names was Sylvia Coombs. Miss Marple's path was unhurried. She carried her handbag on her forearm and her parasol not for the sun, which had all but vanished, but more as a nod to gentility. She walked as though on no particular errand, pausing once to comment to young Lionel Pettingle busy scraping moss from his mother's stone, that the green bottle mixture might work better with a stiff brush. In truth, her mind was wholly occupied with the woman in gray. The glimpse she had caught was brief, but telling. The hair beneath the hat had been unmistakably auburn, touched now with the silver of age, and the woman's gait had the composed purpose of someone used to walking alone, with thought. She had passed along the lane from the vicarage, cut across the small path that skirted the back gardens of Orchard Row, and Miss Marple would wager a penny continued on toward the older part of the churchyard, near the broken sundial and the forgotten paupers' graves. It was a path few villagers took, unless they had reason. Miss Marple arrived at the Lich Gate 20 minutes after the woman had passed and stood beneath its moss-darkened beams. It was empty now, save for the faint smell of crushed ivy and weathered wood. She moved slowly down the gravel path, casting her gaze across the rows of headstones, noting the scuffed grass, a cigarette butt near the south wall, Reggie Pierce. Again, no doubt, and beneath the willow footprints, light but fresh, where someone had stood recently. They led directly to Sylvia Coombs's grave. The white roses had not been disturbed, but something had been added, a small card, carefully tucked beneath the petals. Miss Marple looked about, then stooped to retrieve it. Written in an elegant, looping hand likely a woman's, though aged, were just 4 words. "Forgive me. I remember." She held it for a long moment, her heart tightening in that peculiar way it did when the past pressed its cold fingers through time. She had seen such notes before, some left anonymously, others discovered years later in drawers, or behind paintings. They were never written for the living, but for the dead, and for the conscience of the writer. She replaced the card precisely where she had found it. From somewhere beyond the churchyard wall came the faint sound of a train's whistle, a distant echo of steam and steel. The 5:37 from Paddington, most likely, a reminder that the wider world still turned while the quiet truths of St. Chad's Mead remained rooted in its soil. Miss Marple turned and walked back through the graves, toward the square. She stopped, briefly at the Coombs plot again, not Sylvia's but her parents', 3 stones to the left. The inscription was faded, but she remembered it well. Jonathan Coombs, 1858 to 1919. Agatha Coombs, 1863 to 1937. They shall rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. Sylvia's stone had no such epigraph, a fact which, to Miss Marple's eye, was both poetic and pointed. Back on the high street, the lamps had begun to glow behind lace curtains. A thin spiral of chimney smoke curled up from the blacksmith's cottage, and at the post office, the last telegram of the day was being typed by Mavis Codd with her usual slow deliberation. Miss Marple, however, continued on to the Old Bell Inn. She had learned long ago that one could glean more from a pub in 10 minutes than from the parish minutes in 10 years. And behind the bar was Franklin Rudge, whose memory for family details and whose ear for whispered remarks was as sharp as the knife he used to slice pork pies. Franklin, rotund and ruddy-cheeked, greeted her with a surprised smile. "Evening, Miss Marple. Don't usually see you in before supper." "I thought I might take a lemonade," she said, settling herself at a high stool with modest dignity. He poured it himself, then leaned on the polished counter. "You've heard, then?" "Heard what, Mr. Rudge?" His eyes twinkled with pleasure. "About the stranger." Miss Marple sipped delicately. "Ah, yes. The woman who sat in Mrs. Fullerton's pew last week. That's the one," he said. "Name's Mrs. Martin, according to Mrs. Higgs. She overheard the booking at the lodgings. Said she was from Devon, though she didn't sound it. Bit more refined, like." "Did she mention how long she was staying?" "Only a week, apparently. Booked a top room at Mosley's guest house. Paid in advance, too. Odd sort, by Mrs. Higgs's account. Quiet, but not shy. More like watching everything." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Did she say what brought her here?" Franklin shrugged. "No family left here, far as I know. She said she was visiting old ground. You know what that means." "Sometimes," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "it means quite a lot." Just then, the door creaked and a breath of cooler air followed a new patron. Miss Marple turned slightly, but it was only young Freddie Wells, looking for his father. "I shall finish my lemonade and be off," she said, rising slowly. "Will you be attending evensong tonight?" Franklin asked. "I expect so," she replied. "One must be seen at the right places at the right times," he chuckled. "You'd make a fine detective, Miss Marple." She gave a wry smile. "One learns to observe, Mr. Rudge, especially in villages." Back at Danemead Cottage, as the evening deepened and the moths began their tapping at the lampshade, Miss Marple settled into her chair by the fire, knitting needles clicking like the tick of a discreet clock. There was a memory stirring Sylvia Coombs. White roses. A pew sat in by the wrong person. And now a name. Mrs. Martin of Devon. But Miss Marple had a hunch that wasn't the whole of it. The name Martin was common enough. Convenient. Too convenient. People hiding in plain sight often chose names like Smith, Brown, or Martin. And then there was the note. "Forgive me. I remember." A tone of guilt. But for what? Miss Marple had not forgotten the fated scandal that hung like mist around Sylvia Coombs's death. A fall from the bell tower, they said. An accident. But no one had ever explained why she was there, to begin with. Or why Margaret, her sister, had left so soon after, never to return. Until now. If Mrs. Martin was who Miss Marple suspected, then this was not just a visit. It was a reckoning. And reckoning had a curious way of bringing both truth and danger to light. Chapter 6. A question of forgiveness. The following morning brought with it a sky the color of curdled milk, soft and low, pressing upon the rooftops of St. Chad's Mead like a woolen shawl. It had rained lightly in the night, just enough to awaken the scent of damp ivy and turn the cobbled paths slick. The air was quiet, muffled by the hush that often comes with overcast skies, and the village seemed to tread more softly as a result. Miss Marple, ever an early riser, had already completed her morning routines and was seated at the breakfast table, finishing a small portion of stewed apple with a sprinkling of cinnamon. Beside her teacup, carefully unfolded, lay that morning's edition of the Northeast Somerset Gazette, which, as she suspected, made no mention of Mrs. Martin or the curious incident in the pew. But then again, village mysteries seldom made headlines. No. Their clues were scattered elsewhere among gossip half-whispered in butchers' shops, in sidelong glances during communion, and in the gentle interruptions of one's daily errands. Miss Marple folded the paper and tucked it away. Today, she meant to pay a call. Mausley's guest house, situated just past the iron gate of the village green, was a tall, narrow structure with pebble-dashed walls and an ornate brass bell beside the door. A weather-beaten sign bearing a painted teapot swung gently on its iron bracket above. Mrs. Mausley herself, a thin, sharp-jawed woman with a fondness for starched collars and very little nonsense, answered the door at once. "Miss Marple!" she exclaimed, though not without suspicion. "What a surprise!" Double quotes. Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Good morning, dear. I wonder if I might trouble you for a cup of tea, on the pretense of admiring your geraniums, of course." Mrs. Mausley's mouth pinched in what passed for politeness. "Well, come in then." The sitting room was tidy and impersonal, the sort of space that bore the traces of many visitors, but no memories. On a sideboard, a tray of scones sat untouched, their raisins glinting like small flies in the morning light. "Your guest," Miss Marple said gently, accepting her tea. "The lady in gray, she is still staying with you, I presume?" Mrs. Mausley hesitated a moment too long. "Mrs. Martin?" "Yes, quiet, as I'm sure you've heard. Keeps to herself. Bit odd, but no trouble." Miss Marple took a sip of her tea, feigning casual interest. "I believe I saw her in church on Sunday. Sat in the Fullertons' pew, didn't she?" "So she did," the woman replied, folding her arms. "Said she hadn't been to St. Chad's in years. Didn't know where to sit, I suppose. That's what she told me." Miss Marple let a beat pass before speaking again. "I do wonder what's brought her back." At this, Mrs. Mausley looked momentarily startled. "Back? You mean, oh, I assumed she'd been here before. It's rare, after all, that one selects St. Chad's Mead for a holiday." Mrs. Mausley stared at her for a long moment. Then reluctantly, she leaned closer. "Well, I did find it strange." She asked after the church clock the day she arrived, and the bell tower. "Odd, isn't it? Who asks about bells?" "Someone with unfinished business," Miss Marple murmured. The older woman's eyes narrowed. "You know something." "I suspect something," Miss Marple replied. "And suspicion, I've learned, is often the lantern that leads one through dark corridors." Just then, a soft creak on the stairs. Both women turned as Mrs. Martin descended. She was dressed in gray once again, though a darker shade this time storm cloud rather than dove. A brooch in the shape of a thistle adorned her collar, and her gloves were tightly buttoned. She froze upon seeing Miss Marple. Their eyes met, the expression that flickered across Mrs. Martin's face was not alarm nor hostility, but something like recognition. Miss Marple rose gently. "How do you do? I believe we've not been introduced." "I am Miss Marple. I saw you at St. Chad's on Sunday." Mrs. Martin inclined her head. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and unhurried. "Yes, I remember you." Her tone carried an echo of something unspoken, perhaps weariness. "May I offer my condolences?" Miss Marple added softly. There was a long pause. "For?" Mrs. Martin asked, though her voice caught. "For Sylvia." The room stood still for a moment, the very ticking of the clock seeming to pause. Mrs. Martin blinked. "You knew her?" "I did," said Miss Marple. "Not well, but well enough. I remember when she died. It distressed the village." Mrs. Martin's gaze did not waver. The village liked to be distressed. It gave them something to do. Miss Marple did not rise to the remark. She gestured gently to the armchair across from her. "Would you sit a moment, Mrs. Martin? Or may I call you Miss Margaret Coombs?" Mrs. Mosley gave a strangled noise, hand flying to her mouth. Mrs. Martin's face paled, yet she did not deny it. She lowered herself into the chair, her gloved hands resting in her lap. "Why now?" Miss Marple asked gently. "After all these years?" Margaret looked away, toward the curtained window. "Because I cannot unsee it anymore. Because sometimes silence begins to rot the soul." There was a trembling in her voice, but not weakness. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone still calm. "Did you write the card?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes, I had to say it, even if she can't hear it." The silence that followed was heavy, yet oddly comforting, like the settling of dust after a long slammed door has finally been opened. "I didn't kill her," Margaret said after a moment, "but I let her die." The confession lingered like smoke in the air. Before Miss Marple could speak, the front door rattled and a loud knock shook the frame. Mrs. Mosley leapt to her feet. "Now who on earth?" She opened the door to reveal Inspector Crail, his coat unbuttoned, spectacles fogging slightly from the rain that had begun anew. "Good morning," he said grimly. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Mosley." Then his eyes found Margaret, "I believe," he said slowly. "We need to talk about your sister's death, Miss Coombs." Margaret did not flinch. Chapter 7. The sound that never rang the parlor of Mosley's guest house had taken on the stillness of a confessional. Inspector Crail stood just inside the doorway, shaking rain from his sleeves, while Margaret Coombs, formerly Mrs. Martin, remained in the armchair by the fire, her hands still clasped in her lap. She looked as if she might splinter at the edges, yet there was a quiet resolve to her, like someone who had finally decided to stop running. Miss Marple observed the inspector's bearing with mild interest. Though a touch younger than she would normally approve for proper village policing, Crail had something that could not be taught: restraint. A great many men, when placed in the presence of a confession, leapt upon it with too eager a hand. But not Crail. He allowed silence to do part of the work. He turned to Miss Marple with a faint nod. "I suspect you've gleaned more from this lady than I have from my entire morning at the records office." "Not more," she replied mildly, "merely different." Crail approached Margaret and took a chair opposite her, careful not to crowd the space. "Miss Coombs," he said evenly, "you've just admitted that your sister's death might not have been entirely innocent." Margaret's eyes did not rise to meet his. "I said I let her die, not that I pushed her." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, "you might start by telling us precisely what happened." Margaret exhaled. "It was 17 years ago, the night of the Ascension Day service. Sylvia had asked me to walk home with her after the bells, but I refused. I was cross with her. Silly, petty things, a borrowed necklace, an argument over something trivial. I told her I didn't care if she walked alone. She glanced out the window, and so she did." Inspector Crail took out a small notebook, though he did not yet write. "Where did you see her last?" "At the foot of the church path," Margaret replied. She had her hymn book under her arm and was trying to be cheerful, though I'd wounded her pride. Miss Marple spoke gently, and then I waited at home for her to return. But she never came back. We found her the next morning. A silence. "Where?" Crail prompted. "Face down in the brook," Margaret said quietly. Her ankle had caught on a tree root. She'd fallen from the footbridge. They said it was an accident. Her heel had snapped, they said, and the planks were wet. But I never believed it. "And yet you told no one," Miss Marple said, without accusation. Margaret's gaze grew distant. "Because there was something strange. Sylvia had told me days before that someone had been following her." "Following her?" Crail's eyes sharpened. "Did she say who?" "She thought it might be Mr. Channing," Margaret said. "You remember him?" Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "He was the bell ringer at St. Chad's, wasn't he? The one with the twisted knee." Margaret nodded. "He always lingered longer than necessary after practices. Always near the pews where she sat, but no one ever took her seriously. People said she was fanciful. Even I... She trailed off. I dismissed her fears, she finished finally. And when she died, I told myself it was all coincidence. But I've never been able to shake the feeling that she knew something. That she was afraid of something, and it caught up with her that night. Inspector Crail tapped his notebook gently. Channing died years ago. A heart attack on the bus to Bath. But if your sister feared him, we should consider the possibility that her death was not, in fact, accidental. She had a mark on her wrist, Margaret said softly. A bruise. They said nothing sinister, but it looked like a handprint. Miss Marple gave a soft sound in her throat, part sigh, part realization. And yet it was filed away as misadventure. Precisely, Margaret said. It didn't matter that the bridge had no railing, or that she wouldn't have walked that way in the dark unless someone called her down the path, or that the church bells rang that night, except, oddly enough, the tower clock showed no record of them being rung, and no one remembered hearing them except me. Miss Marple sat up slightly. Are you quite certain of that? Absolutely, said Margaret. It's the very reason I've come back. I heard them again 2 weeks ago, the same bell tone. And this time, I wasn't dreaming. That's why I wrote the card and placed it in the pew. I thought perhaps I wasn't the only one who remembered. Crail blinked. You heard the bells recently? Yes, she said. Late at night. I was visiting my cousin in Monk's. Lee just one stop up the rail line, and I took a walk down to the old canal footpath. I heard the bells across the fields. Clear as anything. 4 slow tolls. But the bells at St. Chad's had been silent for years, Crail murmured. The mechanism jammed. Reverend Silas had then retired. Miss Marple, however, had gone perfectly still. She looked not at Margaret, but at the fireplace. Her eyes, however, were far away. 4 slow tolls, she said thoughtfully. Not a peal? No, Margaret said. Just 4, and then silence. Miss Marple's expression turned inward. What are you thinking? Crail asked. Miss Marple blinked and looked up. I'm thinking that someone is sending a message. Later. That day, Miss Marple took her daily walk through the churchyard. She wore her pale blue coat and sensible gloves, and carried a small posy of forget-me-nots gathered from her garden. It was not her usual route, but she felt drawn toward the old bell tower and the long-disused path behind it. The bell tower was locked, as expected. But it wasn't the lock that interested her. It was the wear on the stone step, which looked scuffed with recent use. The forget-me-nots trembled slightly in her hand. She made her way to the footbridge, where Sylvia Coombs had fallen. It was no longer used, the planks gray with rot and ivy pushing up through the cracks. Below, the brook ran sluggish and brown. Miss Marple stood for a long while, letting memory and instinct coil together. There had been a bruise. A sound. A fall. A bell that rang when it should not have. And now, 17 years later, it had rung again. Miss Marple straightened. I shall need to speak to the Reverend, she said aloud. Not to the stream or to the dead, but to the story. That had not yet been finished, and stories she knew always came to their final page eventually. Chapter 8. A Matter of Memory and Bells. Miss Marple found Reverend Silas in his modest study at the vicarage, nestled between tottering shelves of ecclesiastical tomes and a gleaming brass oil lamp that had somehow survived the war untouched. He was bent over a volume of parish records, a magnifying glass in hand, when she knocked gently on the open door. Ah, Miss Marple, he said, straightening. Do come in. I was just perusing the confirmations of 1927-1. Finds them oddly comforting when the world feels unanchored. I quite understand, she said pleasantly. There is something about records and names and ink, things set down, that gives one a sense of continuity. He gestured for her to sit, and she chose a chair near the window, her handbag placed primly on her lap. I'm afraid I haven't the foggiest idea why you've come. he said, adjusting his spectacles. Though I did hear from Mrs. Truelove that the woman in the third pew turned out to be someone with a history here. Yes, Miss Marple said. Her name is Margaret Coombs. She was born Margaret Martin. Her sister, Sylvia, drowned 17 years ago, just after the Ascension Day service. The vicar's expression tightened. Yes, I remember that. A dreadful tragedy. Miss Marple studied him quietly. You were newly installed here then, weren't you? He nodded. Just 6 months in, I barely knew Sylvia. Pretty quiet. A teacher, I think. Margaret worked in the dressmaker's shop. She did, Miss Marple confirmed. She believes her sister's death may not have been accidental. Silas blinked. After all this time, she also believes she heard the bells from St. Chad's recently. 4 slow tolls. The vicar's eyes widened slightly. Impossible. The bell mechanism has been corroded for years. The ropes are frayed, and we stopped maintenance after the vestry leak destroyed part of the ringing chamber. Yet, Miss Marple said, someone heard them. Not only recently, but on the night Sylvia died as well. Silas leaned back, fingers steepled. Miss Marple, are you suggesting someone has been using the bells to send a signal? I wouldn't put it so melodramatically, she replied. But it does strike me as curious that bells which officially haven't rung in years should be heard at key moments by those most intimately connected to a past death. The vicar looked thoughtful. Perhaps a child playing at being a ringer? You know how boys are. I do, said Miss Marple. But I rather think this was not a child's prank. She leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Reverend, who had access to the tower after it was sealed? He rubbed his chin. It was locked by the diocesan order in 1948. Only the warden. Mr. Pevensey had the key, and I believe he gave a duplicate to Mr. Noel, our late organist, though that key was never recovered after his passing. The door has remained bolted since. Mr. Noel, Miss Marple repeated. Now there's a name I've not heard in some time. An odd fellow, Silas said. Lived alone in Ivy Gables, just at the edge of the rectory fields, kept to himself. A gifted organist, but rather consumed by the old rituals. Always muttering about the loss of true liturgy. He believed in signs and portents. And did he know the Martin girls? She asked. Silas paused. He must have, I suppose. He was present at every service, but I don't remember any interaction. He wasn't the sort to make social overtures. Miss Marple looked out the window, her eyes narrowing slightly. He died 2 years ago, didn't he? Left the house to a cousin? Yes, some fellow from Dover. The house has sat empty since. I wonder, Miss Marple murmured, whether something might remain in that house. Something that points to what happened in 1949. The vicar hesitated. If you think it would help, I could call the cousin. He's terribly fond of fishing and rarely about, but I might persuade him to allow you a look. Miss Marple smiled. You're very kind, Reverend. I would be grateful. As she rose to go, he added, Do. You really think there was murder involved? She paused. I think a girl died under strange circumstances, and that there were sounds heard which should not have been. And I think when people go to great lengths to silence bells, it is sometimes because they are trying to silence something else. That evening, Miss Marple invited Inspector Crail for tea in her front parlor, and while he sampled her walnut cake with cautious admiration, she brought him up to date on the vicar's remarks. Ivy Gables, Crail muttered, noting the name. It's been off the radar. No one's considered Noel's connection to Sylvia, because no one thought to connect bells with death, Miss Marple said. But I believe Margaret's memory is more reliable than we've given it credit. 4. Crail tapped the side of his teacup. Assuming someone was using the bells to signal or frighten Sylvia, what would that mean? Miss Marple tilted her head. That someone knew her pattern, perhaps even manipulated her into walking. Down to the footbridge that night, Crail frowned. You think she was lured? She would not have chosen the darkened path by the brook, Miss Marple said gently. It was muddy, unlit, and unpleasant. But if she heard a sound, perhaps bells, or even a familiar voice, she might have followed it. And then, Crail nodded slowly. Then she fell or was pushed. And no one saw, Miss Marple concluded. But someone, I think, knew. The next morning, Ivy Gables loomed gray and silent under a low sky. The cousin had given permission by telegram, and the key was left under a flower pot, just as Reverend Silas had arranged. Miss Marple entered with Inspector Crail in tow. Dust lay in thick drifts over the floorboards, and the air smelled faintly of coal and mildew. The organist's home had the stillness of a place that had once heard music and now recoiled from silence. They found the sitting room untouched, a small writing desk, a stack of hymnals, and a framed photograph of the church. Choir from 1948. Noel himself was visible, standing stiffly at the edge of the group. And just beside him, almost hidden by the foliage of a tree, stood Sylvia Martin. You see? Miss Marple whispered. He did know her. Crail squinted at the image. She's barely visible. Looks like she tried to stand away from they others, or was placed there, Miss Marple said. In the desk, they found a slim diary. Pages filled with dated notations in a tight, precise hand. May 7th. The fourth toll is always for penance. May 12th. She looked at me again. How dare she? May 14th. I rang them for her. She needed to hear. She must be shown. May 15th. She did not listen. The bells must speak louder. Crail drew in a sharp breath. That's the night she died. Miss Marple's hands trembled slightly as she closed the diary. And I believe we found our tolling ghost. Chapter 9. What the Dead Leave Behind. The rain began that evening, falling in steady sheets that hushed the usual sounds of St. Chad's Mead. The countryside blurred beneath a pale, persistent drizzle, and the gray slate roofs glistened as if reluctantly recalling long-buried truths. Miss Marple sat by the fire in her drawing room, the diary of the late Mr. Noel carefully wrapped in a linen napkin on her lap. She had shown it to Inspector Crail and returned it to her home, only to copy out certain passages, her eyes growing narrower with each line. Outside, the village looked unchanged, but she could feel the weight of old secrets pressing close. Just beneath the rain-washed surface, the bells, she thought. The bells and the girl. There was something else. Something she had missed. The fourth toll is always for penance. Noel had written that with an unsettling certainty. Miss Marple had known. Many churchmen and choir masters who'd gone a little peculiar in their retirements, but this wasn't eccentricity. It was fixation. A form of moral judgment, turned personal. She closed her notebook and reached for the telephone. The following afternoon brought Margaret Coombs to Miss Marple's parlor once again, summoned by a gentle but urgent note delivered through the baker's lad. Margaret looked pale but composed, wearing the same modest navy coat and carrying her umbrella tightly in both hands, as though fending off the world. You've learned something, she said as she sat down. Yes, Miss Marple sighed. But I'd like to begin by asking you about a man named Noel, Edgar Noel. He was the church organist when your sister died. Margaret's brow furrowed. I remember him. Thin man, a bit odd. He lived in that gloomy cottage past the hedgerow. Did Sylvia ever speak of him? Margaret hesitated. Not really. She said he made her uncomfortable, that he sometimes lingered near the school gates when she walked home. She told me once that she thought he watched her during services, but I told her she was imagining it. Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. She wasn't. We found his diary, and it appears Sylvia was very much on his mind. Margaret looked stricken. You mean he... No, Miss Marple said gently. He didn't confess to anything directly. But the night Sylvia died, he wrote that the bells must speak louder. He seems to have used them to send her a message, or perhaps a warning. But what troubles me most is the way he speaks of her, how she needed to be shown. as if she had committed some moral transgression he could not forgive. Margaret sat very still. Sylvia was kind. She was shy and good. She didn't deserve to be watched like that. No, Miss Marple agreed. She didn't, but perhaps Mr. Noel thought otherwise. A silence stretched between them. Then, Margaret said, almost in a whisper, he wasn't the only one who judged her. Miss Marple looked up sharply. Margaret continued. There was someone else. Reverend Morley. He was the vicar before Silas. He once called Sylvia into the vestry after she stayed behind to arrange the flowers. She came home crying. Did she say why? She wouldn't tell me. But I heard her muttering that she'd done nothing. Wrong, that it wasn't her fault. Miss Marple felt a chill. And Reverend Morley? She asked. He left the parish not long after Sylvia died. Said it was due to family illness, but people said it was sudden, and there was no farewell. Sermon. I see, Miss Marple said. She rose and crossed to her side table where the phone rested. If you'll excuse me a moment. Reverend Silas listened quietly as Miss Marple relayed what she'd learned. When she mentioned Reverend Morley's name, there was a pause. I've read the old vestry reports, he said cautiously. There was no scandal on record. But I did hear once from the church warden's wife, long ago, that Morley had been counseled by the diocesan bishop for matters of conduct. Unsubstantiated. No formal inquiry. And what became of him? He died in 1952. Heart failure. He was only 56. Miss Marple thanked him, hung up, and sat back in her chair. Not murder, she said softly, but a shadow, and shadows have long memories. Later that week, Inspector Crail arrived with news. He had followed Miss Marple's recommendation to inspect the bell tower. A locksmith had opened the long rusted door. I found this wedged behind a loose stone, he said, setting a small parcel on her table. Wrapped in oilcloth was a brass chain, tarnished and broken along with a silver locket. Inside was a miniature photograph. Sylvia Martin, aged 17. Mr. Noel likely stole it, Crail said. Or perhaps she dropped it during an encounter. Miss Marple turned it over in her fingers. The back was engraved faintly, to Sylvia. May she always hear music. A signature. Jace Crail frowned. That's not Noel's initials. No, Miss Marple said slowly. But I believe I know whose they are. The next morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Lucinda Phipps, one of the oldest and most talkative members of the Women's Guild. After a polite conversation about the state of the vicarage tea sets, Miss Marple asked casually, "Do you recall who played the violin at the Ascension Day concerts back in the late 1940s? Mrs. Phipps brightened. Oh yes, young Jeremy Stillwell. He was quite the sensation, though his father didn't approve of musicians. He left for London soon after, and I don't believe he ever came back." Miss Marple nodded. And did he know Sylvia Martin? Oh, very well. They were rather sweet on each other. Everyone thought they'd announce an engagement, but after her death, he stopped writing. Last I heard, he was working at a conservatory in Kent. That evening, Miss Marple made one final call to Inspector Crail. "Would you be so kind as to track down Mr. Jeremy Stillwell?" she asked. "I believe he holds the final piece of this long puzzle, and it may be time someone heard the whole truth spoken aloud." Chapter 10. A melody remembered. It was a gray morning, washed in a thin veil of mist that rolled across the meadows like a restless spirit. Miss Marple stood by her window in Church Lane, stirring her tea absently as she watched the hedgerow. Leaves twitch in the breeze. There had been no news from Inspector Crail yet, but she had faith he would find Jeremy Stillwell. Men of that particular sensitivity often left lighter footprints in the world, but those prints could still be traced if one had the patience. She turned from the window and opened her writing desk. Inside, neatly folded alongside a small stack of postcards, lay the now polished silver locket. She had examined it again the previous night, as though its engraved message might change. Under different light. But the words remained the same. May she always hear music, music. That was the key, wasn't it? Not just metaphorically, but literally. For all the theories of revenge, judgment, and scandal, Sylvia Martin had been a girl who loved music. And someone else had loved her for it. The bells had been used to send messages. But there had been another kind of melody, once soft human, filled with emotion. Perhaps Miss Marple thought this was not a story about punishment at all. Perhaps it was a story about grief misplaced, redirected, and quietly simmering for decades. She was still pondering this when the telephone rang. Jeremy Stillwell arrived in St. Chad's Mead 2 days later. He was a thin man in his early 70s, with a slightly stooped back and silver hair pulled neatly behind his ears. His fingers were long, calloused, and graceful in their movements, as though still accustomed to the neck of a violin. There was something gentle about him, but also something guarded, as if he carried an old wound inside his chest like a piece of broken glass. Inspector Crail had collected him from the train station and escorted him directly to Miss Marple's cottage. There, over warm tea and shortbread, he listened in silence as she gently laid out what they had discovered. When she mentioned Sylvia's name, his eyes turned glassy with memory. "I had not heard that name spoken aloud in years," he said. At last, it's strange how the past catches up, even when we think we've buried it. Miss Marple nodded. "I believe you were close." "She was light," he said simply. "Pure and bright. I adored her." He set down his teacup, the slightest tremor in his hand. "We used to meet in the meadow behind the chapel. I would play for her." She said the violin made the air softer. "And did she give you the locket?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes," he said with a soft smile. "I had it made for her. She wore it always, tucked under her collar." Miss Marple nodded. "We found it in the bell tower." Mr. Stillwell looked up sharply. "She died on the church steps," Miss Marple continued. "That locket should have been with her, but it had been removed and hidden, likely by the person who last saw her alive." Stillwell's brow creased. "You think someone else? Someone from the church?" "Possibly," she said. "Do you recall any tension surrounding Sylvia in those days? Anyone who disapproved of your friendship?" His gaze darkened. "Reverend Morley," he said. "He called me into his study once. Said I was leading her astray, that music was a path to temptation. He believed in a strict, joyless sort of piety. Sylvia was afraid of him, though. She never said why." "And Noel?" Stillwell's expression hardened. "The organist? He was always watching, unsettling. One day he left a bouquet on her music stand, unsigned. She was unnerved by it. She tried to laugh it off, but I knew. It bothered her." Miss Marple folded her hands. Mr. Noel left behind a diary. In it, he speaks of the bells as if they were an instrument of divine justice. He seemed to think Sylvia had crossed a line. Stillwell was silent for a long time. "When she died," he said finally, "I couldn't bear it. I left St. Chad's Mead the very next day. I didn't even stay for the funeral. Cowardly, I know, but I couldn't face the town's whispers, or the silence she left behind." Miss Marple gave him a kind smile. "Sometimes," she said softly, "grief chooses its own path through us." He nodded slowly, his fingers tightening around the teacup. "Do you still play?" she asked. "I do, though not often. Only when I remember her." That evening, Miss Marple attended evensong. The chapel was sparsely filled, the air tinged with damp incense. Reverend Silas's voice carried gently through the nave, and behind him the bell tower loomed. Silent for now, Margaret Coombs sat alone in the front pew, her posture upright, her expression fixed. Miss Marple watched her. For a long moment, Margaret had suffered in silence, not only from her sister's loss, but from the weight of years without answers. And though the answers were beginning to surface, they were not yet complete. There was still something missing, something between the tolling bells and the silence of the dead. After the service, Miss Marple walked out with Inspector Crail. Beneath the shadow of the tower, "There's one thing I haven't yet understood," she said quietly. "Why now? Why was Sylvia's death brought to attention after all these years? Simply because someone sat in the wrong pew?" Crail nodded thoughtfully. "And what do you suspect?" "I believe the wrong pew was the right trigger. Margaret saw something that night, something that dislodged memory. But I wonder if there was more, some lingering presence or guilt." They walked in silence for a moment before Crail added, "We've traced a pattern in Noel's diary. He always marked a special bell tolling each year on the anniversary of Sylvia's death, always the fourth toll. Last year he stopped. That's what first struck us." Miss Marple's eyes widened. "Why did he stop?" "He suffered a fall and was briefly hospitalized. After that, he grew more erratic. Then the silence was broken," she said, "and guilt came knocking." She looked back at the chapel. "The answers are here, Inspector, but they are layered in decades of silence. It will take more than logic to unearth them. It will take memory, painful memory." That night, Miss Marple sat once again in her parlor, her knitting untouched in her lap. The locket lay on the side table beside her. She thought of Sylvia, of a girl filled with music and hope, frightened by shadows cast by men in robes and collars. She thought of Jeremy Stillwell's grief, Margaret Coon's haunted silences, and the tolling of bells that had once meant something entirely different. The truth, she felt, was close. She only needed to listen carefully. As one listens to the space between notes in a song, where the real story lives.